Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Mr. Guy Mettan, the director of the Geneva Press Club, I'd like to welcome you all here for this press conference entitled The Persecution of Lula. So today's topic is Lula and Brazil. So the recent event in Brazil brings a bit more tension to this press conference. Today we have Mr. Geoffrey Robertson, a well-known human rights barrister on my right, and on my far right, Mrs. Valesca Teixeira-Zanin-Martins from Lula's legal team, Martin Teixeira-Martins Advocados. So they will speak about the persecution of Lula. Before giving the floor to Mr. Geoffrey Robertson, I would like to receive a little present and sign.
Oh, thank you. Not for the first time.
No, we have also another present. You had a little book,
right.
and now it's a Swiss knife.
Where do I sign?
Oh, just under here.
I was here with the Malpini last time.
Exactly.
It's still the photographs are still
3 years ago, I guess, something
on
like
the
this.
internet.
The conference is live on YouTube and Facebook, and we have most of the viewers on internet. Thank you very much. So I don't know who is starting.
I'll start.
Okay.
Look like this. There we are. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a big news day, isn't it, in Brasilia? We have more public figures arrested. We have their wives, in one case, arrested. We have the president himself of Brazil being accused of offering bribes to help Mr. Cunha, who's been thrown in jail until he makes a confession. What is going on, and how can the prosecution, which in some ways is a persecution of Lula, throw some light on it? What I want to suggest is that Brazil's problems, and they are problems, are large partly because it's a country where the presumption of innocence, that fundamental right, has disappeared. In Brazil, there's a presumption of guilt. That's why Cunha and others were locked up, banged up, without conviction, without being sentenced, because they want to keep them. Mr. Moro and others want to keep them. The car wash operation throws people in prison and keeps them there until they confess. This is something that is wrong, because people should be presumed to be innocent. And of course, it leads to all sorts of other evils. And that is one example of how it's very important to prosecute corruption, particularly political corruption, particularly corruption that eats away at the national fabric when you start to have corrupt national industries. But it's crucial, utterly crucial, to prosecute corruption fairly. Otherwise, it will not be effective in the long run. And I'm going to return to that theme and remind you that the presumption of innocence is there in human rights law, because people can so easily be accused on little or no evidence. People think they're guilty, and yet at the end of the day it turns out that they're innocent. And the presumption of innocence, which says that you shouldn't throw people in prison or demean them or disparage them or defame them, before they're convicted properly by an impartial judge. And that's a crucial thing. You must have an impartial judge. That is what Lula does not have, and perhaps others as well. So we'll return to that. But remember, where there's smoke, there's often fire. But sometimes it's just a smoke machine. And it is so important to follow the rules that history has shown are essential to ensure fair trial, to ensure that people who really are corrupt go to prison, and that those who are wrongly accused should be acquitted. Now, this is about Lula, and he forms a small but significant part of the car wash operation. Most of you will know a little about Lula. I just remind you for a moment that he was selling peanuts on the streets at 8. He was from an impoverished family. He never went to university, probably good, because he never became a Stalinist or any sort of East. When he became finally a trade union leader, his only concern was to improve the lot of the workers, the unemployed, the destitute, many millions of them in Brazil at the time. He was elected president in 2003, called the most popular man in the world. He had 54 million votes. Things have moved on. I think Donald Trump had about 60, but there you are. At the time, he was incredibly popular, and he made Brazil a brick. Britain, the first letter in that acronym of emerging countries, world leaders, and he won the Olympic Games for Brazil, and yet when the games were held, he couldn't attend. The hatred of him stirred up by the global media was such. So where is Lula today? He's on trial before a judge, Judge Moro, who is not only a trial judge, but is the investigative judge who for the last 18 months has kept issuing judgments, decisions, saying that Lula is likely to be guilty. I saw Moro. Goes around the world proclaiming how good he is, encouraging his own publicity. He's something of a judicial egomaniac. He was in London and Oxford at the weekend, dropping hints that he was going to convict Lula. And of course he is, because for the last 18 months he's been issuing these decisions saying that Lula is likely to be guilty. So his telephone can be tapped, his lawyer's telephone can be tapped, his family's telephones can be tapped, seizures and searches and so forth. Well, that's very strange to us in Europe. It's amazing. We don't have judges like that. We don't have judges who organize the inquiry area, who supervise the police and the prosecutors, and who evince their view that a defendant is guilty. They don't go on and then become the trial judge, because their minds are made up. Their judgment of conviction, when it comes, will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But in so many of his earlier decisions, Judge Moro has held against Lula and held that he's likely to be guilty. Well, that's fine if you're a prosecutor. Prosecutors should believe in the guilt of their suspects. But for a judge to act, first of all, like a prosecutor, indicating that his suspect is likely to be guilty, and then to become the judge, without a jury, without assessors, the sole judge of Lula. This is unacceptable, unheard of now in Europe. The European Court of Human Rights, which is fundamental to fair trial in Europe, decided in 1988 that countries couldn't do this. You couldn't have a judge with two roles. You couldn't have him as investigator and you then trial judge. The utter right of anyone on trial is to an impartial judge, a judge who hasn't been involved in the prosecution process. And this is one of Brazil's great human rights failings. It has an old system inherited from Portugal, which inherited it from the Catholic Inquisition. You've seen probably operas with the Grand Inquisitor, Don Carlos I saw the other night, with the Grand Inquisitor who digs up often fabricated evidence, and then decides that the defendant is guilty of heresy and sends them to the stake. Well, that system has been abandoned in Portugal, it's been abandoned in Europe at the insistence of the European Court of Human Rights. You must have an impartial judge who hasn't been involved in the prosecution process. And boy, has Judge Moro been involved in it. So when we took action in the Human Rights Committee here, we did so because Lula had exhausted all his remedies in Brazil. And we took action here rather than in the Inter-American Court, which sits in Costa Rica, closer, you may think. But the Inter-American Court made a ruling against Brazil, a very important ruling, a few years ago in a case called Isha. It decided that it was a gross breach of privacy for any prosecutor to having tapped a suspect's telephone to release the transcripts to the media. Well, that case must have been known to the Brazilian judiciary because it was a ruling against them. What did Judge Moro do? Not only did he tap Lula's telephones and the telephones of his family and his lawyer, but when he thought that the gossip, the public would be excited by the contents, he released the audio tapes to the Globo media, to their delight, because it helps them sell newspapers and makes people watch. It was a grotesque invasion of privacy, completely contrary to the ruling of the Inter-American Court. So if Brazilian judges do not accept the ruling of the Inter-American Court, the only alternative was to take them to the Human Rights Committee in Geneva. Now, in January, Brazil put in a reply to our complaints, and on Monday we will be filing a response to that reply. But the reply was very interesting because Brazil admitted that their judges had two roles: the role of supervising the investigation and the role of running the trial. But they didn't seem to notice that these two roles are entirely contradictory. They didn't seem to be aware that this could be a problem for the judiciary. Well, it is, and I hope that in time the Human Rights Committee will say that Brazil simply has to change the system. You cannot have a judge like Moro, who may be a very good investigator, you cannot have that investigator suddenly putting on the judge's hat or the wig or whatever and becoming a trial judge, because no one will believe that the trial has been fair, no one will believe that any conviction is properly made and fairly made if it's made by a biased judge. And is Moro biased? Of course he is. Not only has he given all these decisions saying Lula's likely to be guilty so his telephone can be tapped and so forth, but He's associated himself in public with Lula's great enemies. He's actually helped to launch a book which defames Lula and says he's guilty. And he has, in many public respects, including his speeches in America and Britain, given hints that he will convict Lula. So there you have this spectacle of Lula, a man who's done the state some service. He's done Brazil, in fact, he's credited even by his enemies with lifting 40 million Brazilians, 40 million, out of poverty. His programs are still used by the World Health Organization. So he's a very significant, certainly the most significant political figure to emerge from Latin America. His presidency lasted for 7 years and was a time when Brazil held its head high. Now it's in ruins, with demonstrations on the street demanding fresh elections, and that may be the only way to resolve the latest allegations against the president. Well, it is not the case that because of his good works in the past, Lula wants any special preference, any immunity, any indulgence, any impunity. Of course he doesn't. He's been prepared to answer whenever police or prosecutors have asked him to. But the least he can expect is a fair process, a fair trial. He hasn't had it. The release of his telephone calls was outrageous. Moro made a grudging apology for that, and even the rather supine Supreme Court ticked him off, said it was bad for him to have released to the public the telephone calls that he'd made, that he had tapped. But that showed the malice of the judge who is now holding this sham trial of Lula. There are other issues involved as well. If you go to Brazil today, and, well, in fact, I think the demonstrations have partly moved on, but certainly for the last 6 months, the opponents, political opponents, have held big balloons of Lula in prison clothes. There have been the Globo media, which is even more right-wing than Mr. Rupert Murdoch's media, has caricatured him in prison clothes. They printed great balloons which are held aloft at demonstrations. And there has been a complete leak of documents and suspicions. The prosecution is led by a man called Dalegnol, who is also very interested in self-publicity. Last September, he hired a television studio. They presented the case against Lula, 90 minutes of national television time before Lula had even gone on trial. This is extraordinary, isn't it? This could not happen in Europe. It could not happen in other civilized countries, in Australia, in Singapore, and in Asia. It couldn't happen that 90 minutes of national television time were taken up by prosecutors alleging that their suspect was guilty. And Mr. Dalegnol, who's really one of the monster prosecutors, has gone further now. He's published a book for his own profit and his own self-promotion. He's published a book saying that Lula is guilty while Lula is on trial. So that this man, who at least deserves the respect of being fairly tried, is being monstered and demonized by the press, by the prosecutors, by the judge, and there's nothing that can be done. There's nothing in the law that can protect. In most countries, they have some form of contempt of court law where you can't give your opinion that someone is guilty in the press. You can't say they're guilty until they're convicted. You can't create a public expectation of their guilt until the court makes the final decision. But in Brazil, there are no laws restraining this kind of activity by the Globo media, which is hostile, has always been hostile to Lula and to the Workers' Party. So that's another problem. The presumption of innocence is simply not protected. And you can see that in the way the car wash operation, instead of proceeding like other anti-corruption operations, getting evidence and considering it, then handing it over to a prosecuting authority, the car wash operation operates like this. It has a suspect and it puts them in jail until they confess, until they make a plea bargain. And of course, the problem is that to get out of jail, you obviously are tempted to confess even if the confession is false. It's the only way Judge Moro will let you out of jail is if you tell him what he wants to hear. And that means very often tell him something bad about Lula. This is a crazy system. We must combat corruption. Much of my life has been spent on that effort. But we do it in ways that are fair. Otherwise, years to come, people will look back and say that was a mismanaged and unfair operation the convictions can't stand. What has happened in Hong Kong, for example, they developed an independent commission against corruption. Wonderful body, lots of power, but it's exercised responsibly, and the evidence gathered is given to independent prosecutors, so that there is an independent trial before a judge who has had nothing to do with the investigation. And that model has been adopted in Sydney, it's been adopted in Singapore, it's been adopted in Tanzania. There are other ways of doing this. In America, they have special prosecutors. In most European countries, there are special forces that collect the evidence with their powers of getting assistance from other countries in finding out who's got what in bank accounts, and they hand it over to be heard by an independent judge. Brazil does not do this in Lula's case. So the problem is not that there is actually no corruption. In Brazil there has been corruption for many years, long before Lula became president. But the problem is that there is no fair way of combating it that is in operation. So that in Lula's case, it has become a persecution rather than a prosecution. Valeska will tell you a little about the trial and the lack of evidence. It's interesting that Lula has lived, when he's out of the presidency, in a very modest, incredibly modest flat on the outskirts of Sao Paulo. He is famous for not taking exotic meals or holidays, or he has all the bank accounts. The car wash has found a number of foreign bank accounts, including bank accounts in Geneva by politicians. None of them touch Lula. No sign of any conspicuous consumption. Even the apartment that he's alleged to have been given by Olderbrecht, although there's no evidence of that, is a pretty modest apartment on a second-rate beach. And it was the actions that form the charge were years after he resigned from he retired from the presidency. There is no allegation, and can be no allegation, that he was ever corrupt as president of Brazil. So one of the problems that Brazil faces today is the overreach of the judicial branch in using laws that are not in conformity with modern human rights standards to which Brazil has signed up. That has contributed to the terrible state that this country, which was so great under Lula, has sunk to. Whether there will be a new election, as the crowds on the streets are saying, demanding today, after the evidence that Mr. Temer was trying to buy the silence of someone, Mr. Cunha, who had been locked up. My question is, what was the need to lock him up in the first place? But that's a whole question of how you go about combating corruption. You do not go about combating corruption in the way that Judge Moro is doing in Brazil.
Thank you, Geoffrey. My name is Valesca Martins. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Close the other.
It's not here. You know, Geoffrey?
You press it down. I'll take mine. There you are.
Oh, yeah, no, this is working. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Valesca Martins, and as already explained by Geoffrey Robertson, we are here to further explain Lula's unfair and biased trial in Brazil. In Lula's case before the car wash operation, due process guarantees and human rights are absolutely disregarded in an attempt to rush it to fit a possible electoral or political calendar. This is not acceptable because the rule of law is threatened, and in the end, the very heart of democracy in Brazil is threatened. So we waited until last week's hearing in Curitiba was over before submitting our response. We now have even further evidence to submit following last week's actions in Curitiba. As a lawyer, my experience in such hearing was shocking. The position of the prosecution and the way Petrobras' lawyers were acting was absolutely absurd. When you are faced with such biased and politically driven hearing, it is essential that the legal defense act in the best interest of the client. We are not going to lie down or go quietly, I reassure you that. It is a classic attack to abuse the defense, and we're not going to stand. Judges are meant to give the perception to the public, to the population, of independence and impartiality. It is not usual what's happening in Brazil, and Judge Moro is not giving such perception. And when that happens, the entire judiciary is threatened. The type of hearing does not meet, that we had last week, does not meet international standards. It certainly does not meet UN standards. In the trial, we have to make sure that it's emphasized that now we've reached a certain stage of the trial. Judge Moro does not let the defense produce evidence. We're forbidden from, we are not allowed to produce forensic expert accounting evidence, which would demonstrate thoroughly and vehemently that no money coming out of Petrobras went into 1 cent went into Lula's account. We cannot have access to any of Petrobras' documents. It's been 3 years. The prosecution has had these documents for 3 years. Petrobras acts as an assistant to the accusation, to the prosecutors, and they have full access to all of the documents. They pinpoint the ones they want and insert it into the procedure, but we want to have full access and to have the equality of arms. It means a balanced procedure where accusation and defense is treated equally. It is a basic principle of human rights and a basic principle of the rule of law. So this goes against the very basis of justice, and it's very important that every Brazilian is aware of the situation that Lula is in Curitiba. In the end of the procedure, we're trying, of course, to produce more evidence, but in the end of the hearing of the witnesses, what we have is that 73 witnesses, which is very important to differentiate from the spectacles that we're actually now seeing, is that witnesses have the obligation to tell the truth. So after 73 witnesses were heard, and 27 of which are accusation witnesses, and they all clear Lula. They all clear Lula of any wrongdoing. They do not know or have heard about any wrongdoing from regarding Lula and Petrobras. And this is very important because even Pricewaterhouse, when asked by the defense, said that they could not identify or they were not informed of any wrongdoing committed by Lula in Petrobras or that they had access to Petrobras or any subsidiaries that they audit. So this is very important. This is a procedure, and it started as a procedure with Dallagnol's PowerPoint presentation that had absolutely no evidence. Not only did the accusation lack evidence, but now we have overwhelming evidence in the files that Lula never interfered in Petrobras with any contracts or any wrongdoing or any illegal activities, or that the beach apartment ever belonged to him. Not even property deed, not even possession. He never even had the keys of the apartment. We proved that he never slept in the apartment, that nobody ever slept in the apartment, neither he did or his family did. So, and even now in 2017, the judicial administrator of OAS, which is the construction company involved in this first procedure regarding the beach apartment, states and declares to the creditors of the bankruptcy that the apartment always belonged to OAS. OAS, Empreendimentos S.A., which is the name of the company. So we have proven that the Lula never participated in any wrongdoing in Petrobras, and that the beach apartment is not his. This file, this procedure should be what we call archived, to be dropped. But what we see is a disregard to the evidence that we produced in terms of innocence. The prosecutors, even Dallagnol in his book, keeps on insisting that they have evidence, even though they lack explaining or specifying which evidence they are talking to. And what we've witnessed for the past month is a desperate attack on Lula by getting people, doing what we call a recall of the plea bargaineers and having them lie. Because why would they lie? Because they are in jail. They have been convicted, sometimes for 26 years, 30 years, 40 years of prison. Some of them are thrown back in jail just so that they could implicate Lula. And this is out in the news. We have done a complaint last year to the federal prosecutor's office because there was an article that came out in a very respected newspaper saying that Leo Pinheiro, the CEO of OAS, was being pressured to have his plea bargain accepted only if he mentioned Lula. And this is exactly what we have seen for the past month. They are trying to fit a script made by the prosecutor's office to somehow make some sense out of that accusation from September 14th of last year, the big PowerPoint presentation with the big arrows pointing at Lula. So it is a sad moment where rule of law is not, and I emphasize this, is not being obeyed. It's not in compliance with any international law in terms of human rights. And Lula will, in all of the procedures, prove his innocence. He clarified all of the questions last week to exhaustion. He was asked 5 or 6 times the same questions over and over again, and he explained them all. He was asked about facts that were opinion outside of the procedure, which is illegal according to our law. So the whole process that we are watching is a process of a judicial hunt, whereby a politically motivated procedure is rushed, where it doesn't obey the rule of law, and this is what we call lawfare. Lawfare is the misuse of the violence of the law to demonize and delegitimize a political opponent. It operates in courts, and it operates in three different dimensions. The first one, as in warfare, is the geography, which is where the battle is fought, and in lawfare, it is the jurisdiction, which is where the court, what court will try the political opponent. The second one is the weapon, which is in warfare, the weapon with which the battle will be fought. And in lawfare, it is the law. So we have criminal law, we have electoral law. It depends, it has to fit the jurisdiction and the facts which are more, which are easier to politically demonize the opponent. The third one is the externalities, which then the media plays a big role in creating a presumption of guilt by throwing suspicions, diversified suspicions all of the time in the media, so that nobody knows what the person is guilty of anymore. And this is what's happening to Lula. Nobody understands, not even the press, I think, understands what in Brazilian press what the procedure is about. So I would like to first explain how the biggest media conglomerate in Brazil dedicated 18 hours of its biggest news show for the past 12 years to demonize Lula. 18 hours of negative publicity. Zero favorable, of course, 18 hours. It is more than 10% of their show. And it's only one show, so if you multiply it by the times, by the daily number of daily news shows they have in a day, it will be an astonishing number of negative publicity in the air, in national television. So this is just an example of how parts of the media in Brazil are handling Lula. And it violates the very presumption of innocence that anybody is allowed to. And let me go back a bit in terms of presumption of innocence, which is, I would like to go back to Marisa, Lula's late wife. Not even upon a tragic death, which was Marisa's death, did Moro come to acquit any member of the Lula's family. He denied her presumption of innocence. He denied her being acquitted as the law states, as the law demands, which reinforces the partiality of this trial. It is impossible for the judge of the 13th Federal Court in Curitiba, to acquit a member of the Lula family, because it's absolutely imperative that he demonizes Lula and the entire family. So we're facing everyday violations, everyday violations of human rights in Brazil. It is a massive attack. It is an attack on the rule of law. Can you imagine if any of us, whoever is listening to this press conference, can you imagine being tried and judge the merits of your case by your declared enemy? He lets himself be photographed with Lula's political opponents. It's not how a judge should act. And this is very objective. Again, Moro violates the code of ethics of the magistrature in Brazil, He violates the ethics codes internationally accepted, such as the Bangalore Code. We have, the judiciary has rules, and he does not obey them. He cannot prejudge people. He cannot say that, he cannot ignore the evidences in the files. He cannot give interviews and keep on hinting that Lula will be found guilty. And again, going back to the files, guilty of what? Because there is absolutely no evidence in the files that could allow, even remotely, a conviction sentence. So what we are living in now, going back to Brazil, what we're living in Brazil is now a very tough, difficult situation. Today we've heard of many troubling new facts, but we have to differentiate what's happening to Lula's case. When there's evidence of corruption, it should be tried, but it should be tried fairly and within the rule of law. Within the rule of law. And this is not the case of Lula. Lula is being politically tried with no evidence to solely and mainly and clearly remove him from a probable electoral election in 2018. Thank you.
So we're now open to questions, and if anyone would like to follow up or ask Valeska or myself a question, please do. But tell us your name first.
Robert James Parsons, independent journalist, and given the history of a certain superpower meddling in the affairs of Brazil, including the support for decades of a military dictatorship, and given the overt support and enthusiasm for the removal of the previous president on the part of the superpower, what role is the superpower playing now in what is happening to Lula? Certainly, this is not an affair to which they are indifferent.
Me too.
Go ahead. You can turn, yeah. Obviously, Lula is being persecuted for what he stands for. We have absolutely no doubt. And it's for the social state, it's for the Brazil of the pride, and for how Brazil's sovereignty was faced when Lula was in presidency. The role of the superpower, I think you have to clarify better the role of superpower. We do understand that certain economic measures taken by the new government actually have been, how can I put this? They have been against the development of Brazil, the social development, against the sovereignty, and therefore perhaps that explains the reason of the superpower. Powerful.
But for example, the funneling of money into opposition groups, the backing of these people by providing them with intelligence and organizational experts and so on. Have you seen, and then this has happened, we know, in Venezuela, for example. This happened in Honduras before the coup in 2009. So do you have evidence of that?
Actually, what we have learned during the hearings is that there is an informal cooperation between the car wash operation task force in Curitiba and the DOJ. The BBC Brazil has reported an informal cooperation between the FBI and the federal police. But this is a report. These are news reports. These are facts as we have encountered with no accusation, but you're reporting on the facts how we have encountered them during the procedure.
As a matter of interest, Lula got on quite well with George W. Bush, although he didn't agree with the Gulf War. He vigorously opposed that, and he supported Latin American leaders whom the White House were trying to ease out. So it was not there is no direct evidence of, as it were, CIA involvement in Lula's trial that I have seen. I have seen some extraordinary behavior from Netflix, which has commissioned a 13-part series based on a book by a hagiography of Judge Moro, which demonizes Lula, and they're making that into a film with a director, a Brazilian director, who has called for Lula's head, so to be cut off. So that is, if you like, the kind of liberty that the American media thinks it can take. But that is, as far as Lula's trial is concerned, other than that, Judge Moro and some of the prosecutors have trained in America or done courses in America and go and speak in America, and one can't help noticing that Judge Moro gets, was it Fortune magazine? Or, Time and Fortune magazine hail him as a hero. There is no direct political connection with the trial itself. There has been, of course, action by the Department of Justice on Odebrecht, pardon my Portuguese pronunciation, and that, of course, may well be justified, but the behavior in relation to the meat industry is another matter that is may well be the responsibility of those of Brazilians rather than Americans. So I have not seen myself as an outsider any direct link with Lula's trial.
Yes.
Good afternoon, Marta Hurtado, Spanish News Agency. I have a few questions, if I may. The first one, sir, you said that these things wouldn't happen in a civilized country. Are you saying that Brazil is not a civilized country? Do you want to answer?
Yes, I do, because it was a slip of the tongue if I made it, and I apologize if to Brazil. Brazil is a civilized country. It's a BRIC. You know, it's the first letter of that somewhat premature acronym. What was it? Brazil, Russia, India, and China. These were the new powerhouses under Lula. And Brazil has traditions going back that are more civilized than most. No, I was making the point that this should not happen in a civilized society like Brazil or anywhere else. No judge in other, we call them democratic societies, with the rule of law, would act like this, as a kind of publicity-crazed jurist who not only condemns the man before he puts him on trial, but then puts him on trial. So that's the point I was making.
Then you mentioned as well that you exhausted all the remedies in Brazil. Could you elaborate a little bit more, take us all the steps you took in Brazil before coming to Geneva? And then as well, you said on Monday you're going to present new evidence. Can you share with us the content of this new evidence? And then finally, there's been new evidence in Brazil that there were 23 meetings with between Mr. Lula and former directors of Petrobras. Can it harm your arguments that he just met twice with those directors? Thank you.
I think Valeska should deal with the last question,
Yes.
and with the second question, and I'll deal with the first and third.
Yeah. No, it does not harm. If you listen carefully during the hearing and his deposition, he says that he only had those meetings with the directors that he specified there. And then he said, except for the ones that I had as a president of the country in terms of strategy. So during 8 years as president, meeting with directors and officers of these national important companies are actually the description of the job. He has to understand what happened. For instance, when the Presse was discovered, do you think the president does not have the right to meet with the directors and the officers? It comes with being a good president, strategizing the oil and gas industry in the country. And to criminalize such a relationship, which happens everywhere in the world, with Obama, with anybody. I'm sure Macron will do the same thing, or Merkel. I mean, to criminalize meetings between presidents and heads of important national and international companies is a threat to the presidency and is a threat to the sovereignty of the country. So he did not contradict himself. If you go back to the hearing, you'll see that.
So far as the filing that we're going to make on Monday, of course it is long and it contains a lot of material, partly to update our initial complaints. We are submitting the book that Mr. Dalagnol has written for his own profit and publicity, which condemns Lula. He's the prosecutor, so it is contrary to the ethics of prosecutors to speak like this and to publish books, certainly before their suspect is convicted. So some of the material will be the outrages that have been committed, the Judge Moro going to London and dropping hints. That was only last week, so it will be up to date. One development that I think is interesting and important, which will be dealt with, is the behavior of the Judges Association. In Brazil, another problem is that all the judges, 1,700 of them, federal judges, belong to a trade union. You see, in Brazil, you become a judge in your 20s. It's a career profession. You never get any idea of defending people, but it's a career profession. And they've got a trade union. Well, there's nothing wrong with that in principle. In my country, England, they would never have a trade union. But I can see that if you've got a career judiciary, it may be a good thing to have a trade union which fights for your independence, which protects your salaries, fights for higher salaries for judges. In Brazil, they're very high, actually. But there are good things that a judges' association could do. But we obtained the press releases of this Judges Association, of which Judge Moro is a member. And when he came in for a lot of criticism for arresting Lula at a time when using a warrant where the law didn't allow him to arrest unless the man had refused to testify, and Lula had not refused to testify, and a lot of people said that was an unlawful warrant. Guess what? The Judges Association, of which he was a member, together with all the appeal judges, issued a press statement saying Judge Moro is right. It was outrageous. And then, when a lot of leading lawyers and leading figures in Brazil said that his release of the secret telephone taps to the papers was outrageous breach of privacy, what does his association do but issue a press release saying it was right? Now, the Supreme Court judge held it was wrong, but here all the other judges have their association backing Judge Moro, who's a member. So we're going to explore the unsatisfactory nature of the judges of Brazil joining associations that pass comment on cases that are still before the court. Again, there seems to be outrageous that the appeal judges, for example, all belong to the association, which issues press statements saying Moro is right before that question of law can be decided. There's been a new development, sadly, tragically. The judge who was involved at the Supreme Court level in dealing with car wash matters, Judge Zavasky, was killed in a plane crash a couple of months ago, and so Brazil government has to appoint a judge to take his place. Now, guess who the Judges Association has recommended? You're right, Judge Moro. Brazil sometimes reaches this kind of chicanery is just astonishing. That this Judges Association, to which all the appeal judges are members, how can they judge fairly when they're members of an association which not only interferes in current court cases by saying that Judge Moro was right, but actually recommends that he be promoted to the Supreme Court? I suppose that may be one way of taking him off Lula's case. But, that is the state of the judiciary in Brazil. They don't seem to realize, to appreciate that this is just contrary to the rule of law. Of course, they're independent, and the Supreme Court has shown that, but there's a difference between independence and impartiality. And the problem here is lack of impartiality.
Can I just point out that the appellate court of Porto Alegre, which is the appellate court in charge of the car wash operation, has ruled in its special court, 13-1, that the car wash operation, therefore its judge, is above the law. It is the operation does not have to follow, because of its exceptionality, does not have to follow normal rules. Now, Zaffaroni from Argentina wrote an article classifying this as an international legal scandal. Therefore, if you talk about how the judicial system in terms of the car wash operation is behaving itself, is above the law.
Any further questions? Yes.
So, yes, a couple of questions as well. First, you mentioned that perhaps the only way out is a new election. Since the Constitution does not put this as a possibility right now, proposing such a thing is violating rule of law or not, first of all. Secondly, last time we were here, I don't remember which one of you, you mentioned that the interest of the U.S. for oil in Brazil was one of the issues. We can go back to the tape, and it was very clear that this was said actually by Mr. Cristiano. I wonder, do you still maintain this as a possibility? And lastly, how do you see the situation of President Temer today? Thank you.
Well, I cannot speak on behalf of Cristiano, but I think actually even the press has reported on this. Of course, and not only American interest in Brazilian oil, its pre-sal has proven to be pretty successful. So yes, I would say that Americans, Europeans, they all have interest in the Brazilian oil and gas industry, if that's what you're asking. And
what was the other question? There was a
about the calling a new election.
Ah, yes. What I was remarking upon was that the crowd chanting in the streets yesterday demanding a new election. Now, I haven't checked with the Constitution to see whether that is feasible, but were Mr. Temer to resign as a result of the credibility of these accusations, then that would certainly be one option. Elections are, in a sense, ways of deciding matters that are incredibly controversial and ways of bringing a country together. So were it constitutionally possible, that might be a very good thing. Whether it is will depend on the Constitution. What I would think, as far as Mr. Temer is concerned, he's in a similar position to Mr. Trump in relation to the production of evidence and the question of tapes. Both of them should be confronted by the alleged tape recordings. Where those tapes are is difficult to know. I've read a report in The Guardian this morning which suggested that they were in possession of a prosecution authority. But it is certainly a matter initially for Parliament to take action and to require him to answer to the public. There's no prosecution as yet, but it is an allegation that he must face, just as Mr. Trump must face the allegations relating to his sacking of the FBI director and relating to the investigation of his Russian links.
Sorry, and just to follow up, his tapping, how different was it from Mr. Lula's tapping?
Well, we don't know because we do know this, that Mr. Lula's tapping was authorized by Judge Moro on the basis that he believed that Lula was probably guilty. He authorized the tapping of his lawyer, including his lawyer's office, which had 250 lines, and the tapping of his members of his family, including the wife of one of his sons. There were all sorts of... And this was the material that he released to the press. And it was particularly different because the warrant had run out at 11 o'clock on the morning of March the 16th. And at 2 o'clock, the President Dilma called Lula. And the warrant, although the warrant had run out, the tapping continued unlawfully, so with blatant illegality. And he was so determined to keep the investigation, so determined to have Lula blackguarded and demeaned, that he released that tape to the media, and that was what got him criticized by the Supreme Court for this outrageous invasion of privacy. But that was at the behest of Dilma. Lula himself could not bring the case. It was the fact that she was president that allowed him to bring it. So the cases would seem to be completely different because, as I understand from the press, this was not an authorized telephone tap. Presumably, the fellow who was being asked to provide money for Cunha's family was wired for sound, as the Americans say, had some recording device that, so it was in that situation entirely different.
Can I just remember that the tapping that we're referring to in May 16th said absolutely nothing that could implicate any wrongdoing on behalf of Dilma or Lula at that time, which is then brings us to which was completely different from the cases we're dealing now with.
Any other questions?
Do you think Global changed positions because they were the ones releasing the tapes on Temer? Thank you.
Too early to say.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming, and no doubt we'll be back.
Yeah.
This one will run and run.